Hello to all of you here in the room. It's so great to see all of your faces. Hello to those of you joining us online. It's so great that you're joining us from your couch in your pajamas. Honestly, I'm just jealous of you. That's all it is. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cassie Clark, and I am going to talk to you today about how to embrace a behavior-first mindset, bring a new approach to our work. Hopefully, there we go. First, a little bit about myself. I'm the Security Awareness Engineering Manager at a company called Brex, which is part of the fintech space. I'm based out of Portland, Oregon in the States. And as mentioned, I have quite a few passions, coffee being top of the list, also a big fan of otters, and conveniently, human behavior. And that came out through many of my S-curves, which Amanda so politely called, and I tend to refer to as existential life crises. Human behavior is what this presentation is all about. Okay. We often come into awareness spaces being asked to train users, educate them on the top risks, and that's important. And I'm here to talk to you about a way that we could be even more impactful and influential in our work. So today we're going to talk about what's actually behind all of those behaviors, both the secure ones we want people to do and the insecure ones that we want them to stop doing. We'll talk about some principles of behavior change, things we can incorporate. We'll look at how we can identify which behaviors we should be targeting in the first place. And we'll think about ways that we could infuse behavior science into our work and make it even more impactful. Does that sound good to everybody? I saw one nod and I heard a whoop, and I'm going to go with that. All right. Behavior is a complex part of everyday life. And yet I'm sure we're all frustrated regularly by watching our employees continue to do these insecure behaviors, right? Come on, people, we've trained you how to do this. Why do you still do the thing? What if we're being perfectly honest? We're probably all guilty of doing some behaviors we're not exactly proud of from time to time, or maybe not doing the things we want to do. So tell me if any of these resonate with you. I want to work out more. I know that getting physical and getting stronger is going to help me with my daily activities and probably help me later in life. I'm going to go to the gym. Somehow I can't seem to make myself go. I want to eat healthier. I have learned that eating healthier is better for my physical and mental health. I'm going to stop eating junk food. Unless it's 10 o'clock at night and I'm digging through my cupboards and somehow all I'm eating is junk food. Okay, I'm going to ask you all a spicy question. No blame, no shame, no judgment. How many of us here regularly use a password manager? About half the room. We're security professionals. We teach people how to do this stuff all day long, right? We know that being more active is likely to give us that positive impact we desire. We know that eating healthier is likely to improve our physical and mental health. We know exactly why we should use a password manager. We talk about this all the time. We know these things. Why don't we do the behaviors we want to do? Well, it turns out information alone is not enough to create sustainable behavior change. Knowledge is great and important on an intellectual level. People need to know what to do in order to do it. But we need a more integrated behavioral approach, something that takes into account the complexities of our daily lives, our patterns, our habits, all of the things that drive us moving forward. And there are many, many causes behind behavior. So I'm going to highlight just a few for you. We'll start with some individual drivers. So knowledge, sure, that is a factor in how people change behavior. There's also things like motivation. Why are we compelled to do or not do a behavior? Is it or intrinsically driven or driven by internal forces? Motivation doesn't have to be, but it can be deeply personal. Our biology plays a role in how we behave. So our brain chemistry, our hormones, our nutrition, all these things play a factor. And speaking of, related to that would be our automatic thinking. So researcher Wendy Wood, who's sort of the preeminent researcher on habits and habit formation, says that 43% of our daily lives are spent doing things without thinking about them. 43%. And although his research has not been widely successfully replicated, Daniel Kahneman popularized the theory that up to 95% of our days are spent reacting automatically without thinking. And as little as 5% of our brains operate deliberately or slowly. That's a big deal. Now, this does make a certain amount of sense if you think about it. This is also including things like our brains telling our lungs to take in oxygen. But it also includes things like our daily habits or patterns. So an example, let's say that you want to get into your car to drive to your preferred grocery store. Are you going to think about every single move you need to make to get from sitting in the car to the grocery store and back? Of course not. We would never go anywhere, right? Our brains learned this series of actions and it has turned it into a repeated cadence. It has made it an automatic process. This is the way all of our habits and our daily patterns are formed. Speaking of habits, did you all know that you actually cannot unlearn a habit? So a habit is essentially neural pathways that have been built over time. You don't actually unlearn those. You actually build new neural pathways to create a new habit over the existing habit. And the old one doesn't really go away. The other one just becomes stronger. So you can see why if an insecure habit is reinforced over and over and over again, it could be pretty difficult for someone to change that behavior. Now, there are a lot of little components that go into these individual drivers as well, things such as attitudes, beliefs, emotions, goals, how someone sees themselves, that sort of thing. And then there are our social and external drivers as well. Things like the complex codes that our societies have that develop and reinforce our behavior. Humans are social beings. And almost all of us want to fit in and belong, and there's nothing wrong with that. It does, however, present some challenges when we think about behavior. The unique experiences we encounter throughout our lives play a role in our behavior. This could include anything from our living situation as a child, our work settings, our relationships, etc. The things we go through shape us, and they play out in our behavior. And motivation makes it onto this list as well. So there are also extrinsic factors or things driven by external forces, such as reinforcement from a peer group or rewards. And some of the smaller components that feed into these would be things like feedback, how someone is cued to do a behavior, their environmental context, that sort of thing. So clearly there are a lot of factors behind behavior, right? And that can feel really overwhelming when we're thinking about how to address these behaviors in our work. But understanding some of what's behind all of this can help us learn how to better target and then mitigate those behaviors and be more successful. And quite frankly, there are some principles of behavior change that we can use to guide us along the way. So first and foremost, we want to start by isolating a behavior. What are we trying to affect? When and where is there a decision being made that we could influence? We don't want to use the same solution for multiple behaviors if possible, because frankly, it's not likely the same drivers are behind all those behaviors. We want something that's more integrated. Similarly, we don't want to ask somebody to change multiple behaviors all at once because they're frankly less likely to be able to adhere to them across the board. We want to start small, get granular, and focus on just a few. But Cassie, How do I even know which behaviors to target in the first place? Oh, thanks for asking. We focus on why people do what they do. Your internal resources are going to be the how. Some of the best relationships I've made in my time doing security awareness are with detection and response teams. They are by far my greatest resource for behavioral data. They have insight into monitoring that I don't have access to. They can let me know about social engineering and phishing attempts from a more in-depth lens. They have access to internal reporting rates, etc. And in turn, they rely on me to provide an end user perspective or to socialize relevant threats to our company. It's a great symbiotic relationship. Similarly, our IT teams also are important. They also have access to systems that I don't have access to without admin privileges. So things like password managers, OS updates, system patches. They could implement a nudge or a pop-up for me. They could implement technical solutions if we decide that's the best path. And again, I can be a benefit to them as well. I could help them with things like how to drive down that patch time. And then we are also a great resource for our own behavioral data. So one of my favorite ways to get data is through something called a perception audit, which is essentially a survey where you're asking employees to self-report on their security behaviors, and then you take that data and analyze it against behavioral data that you're seeing in your systems. You can identify those gaps. It can be very insightful. But we could also do things like employee personas, focus groups, surveys, interviews, etc. There's lots of room to get creative here. And there are some fantastic industry resources as well. Highly recommend you check those out. So CyberSafe has a great list of security behaviors. It's in a comprehensive database. Many thanks to Oz and his crew. SANS also has the human risk register and a list of metrics that we can go to look for, if nothing else, where we could get some of that data. But there's also great resources in terms of what we should be collecting. And of course, there's our annual Verizon DBIR, which for the past few years has shown human risk to be top of the list. These are all great resources. And you should make sure that they are as specific to your company or industry as possible. We probably all experience social engineering and phishing, right? But the way those attacks come in might look different for each of us. So for example, in the fintech industry, which is what Brex rolls up into, we absolutely do experience social engineering and phishing, but it looks like things like malware, account takeovers, payment or invoice scams, third-party impersonation. Try to get specific to you. Okay, so we've isolated our behavior, not just going to assume an educational solution as the only response, right? Next, we want to identify some potential reasons behind that behavior. So we want to ask ourselves some questions to guide us in this journey. Have we demonstrated the impact of this behavior to our audience? Have we demonstrated the impact, the negative impact of the behavior we don't want them to do? Have we tailored it to our audience? Have we presented it as for their benefit as well? We should also think about some of that habit stuff, right? So are we asking them to create a new habit? What existing habits contradicting the behavior we want them to do? And there's a lot of research around habits and habit formation. I highly encourage you to check out. It's very impactful to this work. And in fact, at the end of this slide there, or at the end of this deck, there is an appendix with some resources in there, and that'll be sent out after this conference. So feel free to take a look. We could also think about things like, how easy is it to do the behavior? Is it overly complex? Are employees able to do it at all? The harder it is for someone to take an action, the less likely they are to do it. Okay, let's go back to our password manager example. So let's say that I have isolated the behavior that I want my company to use a password manager. Let's say maybe I found some data around poor password manager use, maybe some credential theft or phishing data. Now I want to isolate some factors behind it. Have employees shared any pain points around using a password manager? Do they have to request a license and set up the account themselves? Have they already created a whole bunch of accounts using, but let's be real, it's probably the same password, right? These are all things we can think about as we're thinking about how to mitigate the behavior to what we want. Okay. Remember, up to 95% of our brains operate automatically. So we can say it's safe to presume that some small regular interventions would help from time to time. So this could look like a nudge when you want to remind someone to do something, a sludge or added friction when you want to deter them from taking an action, just-in-time training when they make a mistake so they learn right as they're most primed. You want to hit them when they're most primed to make a change and start reinforcing that new neural pathway. Get that habit that you want starting to be built. So again, if we go back to our password manager example, we could have them respond to a nudge or a pop-up, reminding them to sign in. We could have them sign in first thing in the morning. There are options here. Again, up to 95% of our behavior or our thinking operates automatically. The best thing that you can do to encourage a behavior that you want to see is to integrate it into someone's already existing process. So an example, a cafeteria found that people weren't eating vegetables and they really wanted to increase eating vegetables. I can't remember for sure. I want to say it was a cafeteria in a hospital, so there's the link there. And so they made signage and they had a vegetable of the week, and it was nice, but it didn't do the trick. And finally, they moved the vegetables from the back of the line to the front of the line. Can you guess what happened? People ate vegetables because there was still room on their plates. This isn't about knowledge. Integrate it into somebody's process. Make it easier for them to do the behavior you want them to do, and you'll find that you're likely to be more successful. So again, our favorite password manager example, have employees install that password manager on day one. Better yet, have them install it during IT onboarding, so it's the first thing they do. And this will do three things, really. One, you've removed the barrier of them having to request a license. Two, you've had them install it before they've gone and set up all those other accounts where they may or may not be trying to use the same password. And three, you're having them do it in a group of their peers. So now you have social proof working to your advantage as well. And finally, there are times when it makes the most sense to take that decision away from the employee altogether. Now, this is not a punishment. In fact, it can be a blessing. Like, who here wouldn't want at least one decision removed from their daily lives, right? Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Nika. If it's not going to impact their day-to-day heavily, or again, if it makes their lives better, a technical solution can actually be a great way to mitigate behavior and has a very high success rate. So an example of this might be, we could implement screen time lockouts instead of asking people to remember to lock their screen when they walk away from their computer. And it's not always the right solution. So for example, I actually can't think of a time when enforcing use of a password manager is the best solution. That being said, this is up to each company, and there may be data out there that shows otherwise for specific companies, in which case, absolutely go for it. Okay, so there are some principles to follow. So we're gonna close out with a few takeaways here. We can also infuse behavior science into the work we're already doing, and even doing that will make us more successful. So things like consider the amount of information you're putting into your messaging and your training. Keep it concise and try to keep it to as specific and as few behaviors as possible. If humans are overloaded with information, if you're throwing too much at somebody at once, they're just less likely to absorb and retain that material. Similarly, if you think about how often you're messaging, the cadence with which you're sending things out, how wordy those messages are, etc., that can have a big impact as well. We also want to try to create our training and our material in a way that honors as many learning styles as possible. People learn in different ways, and that's fine and that's great, but you want to maximize the amount that people can absorb and retain no matter how they learn. So myself, for example, I am a very visual learner. I actually really struggle to absorb information orally, whereas I have a friend who's a kinetic learner and he learns best by doing. Keeping these things in mind will really help. Social proof can be a fantastic tool in your tool belt when it's to your advantage. It will absolutely work against you if you use them properly. So for example, let's go back to our favorite password manager example. Let's say I want a team to use a password manager and 70% of that team already does. That is a fantastic time to share that statistic. But let's say only 11% of the team already does. If I share that statistic, even with the best of intentions, what I'm actually conveying is that my team doesn't use a password manager and therefore I should not use a password manager. Use social proof only to your advantage. Hopefully by now I've driven this point home, but please integrate security into someone's process whenever possible. You want developers to submit for code review? Embed it into their development lifecycle process. You want someone to use a password manager? Have them install it on day one. Make it a part of their process. Make it easy. And finally, we're going to keep collecting that great data, right? So we're still going to use success criteria we've been garnering from our traditional approaches. That's useful. But we could also include more behavioral data, things like baseline and ongoing assessments and surveys, maybe A/B testing, where we take slightly different campaigns and we direct it to 2 different audiences and see which one is more successful. We could do an analysis of potential barriers to behavior, so we're thinking about these things. The thing to note with behavioral data is you want to make small changes at a time. If you make too many changes or you have too many variables, you actually skew your data and it makes it really difficult to know what's actually the driver behind the behavior you want. So stay small, change only a few variables, and iterate. And a couple of things that you can do right when you leave this conference. You can work with your security partners to identify maybe your top 3 behaviors. One of those could even be an easy win, but you should try to have your highest risk behavior in there if possible. You could select a behavior and just try to brainstorm a list of possible causes using that data. This will get you in the habit of thinking about the different causes, which can get us in the habit of thinking about maybe more creative ways to mitigate those behaviors. We should absolutely be infusing behavior and behavior science concepts into things like our security messaging. Remember, using social proof to our advantage, for example. Again, remembering to collect that data. Collect a lot of it, even if you're not going to be able to look at it or absorb it all at once. You can always look at it in small chunks. You can go back to it over time, but it'll really help you drive your priorities moving forward. And finally, please socialize this approach with your leadership team. Help them understand that part of managing human risk is changing behavior, and changing behavior is more than just doing a training. Knowledge is an important component, and it's only one small component of behavior change. Ideally, it will help them see your added value as well. Okay. Hopefully, I've been able to explain today why our traditional approaches have maybe not always been as successful as we'd hope, why infusing some of this behavioral concept might help improve things for us, what's behind all of those behaviors in the first place, and how we can start to target some of these behaviors to be even more effective. And I do believe for the first time ever presenting here, I have ended early. So thank you so much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.